Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? It's a great pleasure to be here today and a great privilege. And this is a very, very important subject for us to be discussing. What I want to share with you today are some thoughts on the kinds of changes that are taking place. I want to talk about broadband, certainly, technology. I want to talk about education and social inclusion. But I also want to talk about the way in which those ideas change, the meaning of those ideas change when we start to think about post-industrial society, when we start to think about a different image of the future. I'll go very quickly through a presentation which gives you an overview of what it means to change the kind of future that we think about. It's about changing the way we use the future. I want to start with a quote that will be familiar from most of you. It is increasingly clear that the current downturn is fundamentally different from recessions of recent decades. We are experiencing not merely another turn of the business cycle, but a restructuring of the economic order. For some organizations, near-term survival is the only agenda item. Others are peering through the fog of uncertainty, thinking about how to position themselves once the crisis has passed and things return to normal. The question is, what will normal look like? Now, I know that the crisis had different impacts in different parts of the world, and the reaction has been different in even different parts of the economy in places like Canada and Brazil that have different resource bases, different capacities. But the issue, which is common in a discussion from China to Vancouver, in Paris, or in Mumbai, is that we are living a time of transformation. The question is, what do we mean by that? How can we explore that? How can we understand it? And I want to offer you some sense that we are in a period in which there can be very significant change, and the changes can be of the kind that alter the words we use, the institutions we refer to, the idea of culture, the idea of power. These things can change. They don't remain the same. Up on the screen, you will see a time of creative destruction. We had the Gilded Ages, the bubbles, the time when there was a massive expansion and when there was euphoria, the roaring 20s that we know. Then we know that there were very significant periods of recession, very significant periods of disruption. 1848 in Europe, the World War, the Great Depression. And then there were periods of consolidation, of institutional transformation, of extending the gains made after destruction. But I want to point out that destruction played an important role. The discrediting of old ideas, the discrediting of people who were in power and were pushed out of power because they failed, because they destroyed. And that created space for new ideas and the consolidation of new ways of thinking, new institutions. If we're thinking about transition, if we're thinking about major changes, are we in that kind of period? So the question is, do we have the capacity to imagine the next stage beyond the industrial era? It's quite difficult to think about what we do not know. How do we know what we do not know? We don't know what we do not know. So how do we do that? What we see and do in the present depends heavily on what we imagine in the future. One method for thinking and trying to discover what we do not know is to question the way we use the future and the kind of future that we imagine. Because the way we imagine the future structures so much what we see. The idea in this presentation is to use the future to question the present, to think about changes in the conditions of change. If we think about changes in the conditions of change, it means your models, it means your expectations, it means your predictions don't mean anything. Because the model changes. It's not the same model. The conditions of change have transformed it. The relationship of change to the present can be thought of in three categories. I want to offer you three categories to think about this relationship of the present to change. One is substitution. It's very familiar. We can think of the traffic cop, and we can think of the traffic light. Okay? One replaces, it's a better technology, it's cheaper, it's more dependable, 24/7. We can think of complementarity. Here we're at a telecommunications meeting, and we can think of the telephone. There were fears at one point that the telephone would reduce human contact, that people would not go to see their grandmother. But it turned out that the telephone was a complement, and that people used the telephone to set up meetings and to see each other. So it was a complementary relationship of change. But there's also emergence. And here I want to point out that emergence is one of the most beautiful things about our universe. Things that emerge out of the world around us, that come all of a sudden, that are novel, that are unforeseeable. And emergence are things like the Model T, the original Ford car. But what emerged from that was not just faster horses, horsepower, horseless carriage, but something you couldn't anticipate otherwise. The suburb, suburbanization, the creation of an industrial mass production society and economy, with the mass production model of the Ford being used in assembly lines all over the place. Emergence is one of the most amazing things about the world around us. So, are we going to use a model which is catch up to the leader and convergence? Look, it's very natural to follow a convergence model. If you have a big sister or a big brother, or if you see your father, or you see your mother, or you see somebody who's your hero, or somebody who achieves something that you want, you follow them. It's a very flattering thing. It's learning by imitation, emulation, and you catch up with them. And sometimes you pass them. I work in places like Korea and Finland and Ireland, where they always thought, we're going to catch up, we're going to catch up, we're going to catch up to the OECD average. And then sometimes they went past the OECD average. They said, aha, we've made it. But then they had a question. When you catch up, what's next? What's after the frontier? And if we think of leapfrog, when I go to China, they say, aha, we're going to leapfrog. We're going to go past. We're going to skip the steps. We're going to do it better. But I ask them, if you leapfrog, where do you leapfrog to? Where are you going? If you jump over, what is the objective? So what is the image in your mind of the future? The idea here is to use the future to make complexity, emergence, actionable. And I want to give you, again, some categories to think about. Within the system changes, where you have inside-in change, that's improvement, reform, Toyota, teaching General Motors. You have outside-in, where you have the developments in one sector having an implication in another sector. This happens a great deal in education, where the learning and the mobile telecommunications has an impact on the way the school functions. You have change that's outside the system, inside-out change, where the new use of technology inside the firm has an impact on society outside the firm, or on government, and that's from the inside out. And then you have outside out. The emergence of new systems, of new ways of doing things, of a transformation in the system itself. And this often happens outside the existing system. Why? Because existing systems often are contradictory with emergent systems. And so the question becomes how to think about all these different four types of change. Generally, we think about change, and we think about it in terms of this kind of city of the future. Flying cars. Flying cars are a very traditional and typical image of the future. We've been doing this for more than a century, thinking about the future in this very extrapolatory way. The horse goes faster. The car goes faster. It flies. I want to try and think about imagining the future beyond extrapolation. And I'm going to go very quickly through an image of a post-industrial society to show you a bit what it means to have a different image. I want to be very clear. This post-industrial society, about knowledge creation and diffusion in a learning-intensive society, imagination requires frames and tools. You don't have imagination by just saying it's wide open. You have to have the tools to describe things, the words, the concepts, the approaches. I'm not talking about prediction. This is about imagining. If we're talking about prediction, you'll say to me, that's not realistic. Don't think about that. But we know very well that it's not a question of being realistic or predictable. Things change in ways that we can't imagine unless we challenge our imagination. Discovering new anticipatory assumptions. I'm not sure what that. The future we imagine today changes what we do in the present. So let me go very quickly through this idea. Use the future, imagine a learning-intensive society. A learning-intensive society is sort of like this Rip Van Winkle. I don't know how many of you know the American fable of Rip Van Winkle. It's the story of a man who wakes up 25 years after the American Revolution. And that allows him to make a rich description, a very tactile description of the changes that took place. So at the OECD, when I was in the International Futures Program, we ran conferences on transformational change. These are 4 books, Technology, Economy, Society, and Governance. They're available on the internet. And what we talk about is this kind of change. This is a familiar story. Agriculture declines. Agriculture becomes less important. And industry grows up. And everybody feels okay. And here, in an industrializing country, you say, okay, we're on the right part of the curve here. Huh? We're still on the part that's going up. Right? More or less. In Germany, when I say, well, if you don't produce cars, will you still be rich? They go, no. If we don't produce cars, we won't be rich. But this is a fallacy. It's what I call the poverty of the imagination. Because that was exactly the position that they had when agriculture was declining. And they said, there's no way to be rich if we don't have strong and big agriculture. This was the physiocratic position. And they truly believed that only value could come from agriculture. So in this context, we are either emulating industrialization, the future is industrialization, or if you're in France, Finland, Canada, they're saying, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, what will we do next? There's nothing to do in the world. We have no people to take care of, no environment to worry about, no meaning of life, no things to do in the world except produce industrial products and compete with China and compete with Brazil. That's the only thing we can do. And I say, excuse me, that's poverty of the imagination, because there are other things we can do. And I don't have the words for them because the words have to be invented. But they have to do with things like household creation and craft creative. They create value. They create things that are valuable, that are useful, that in a market and transaction system can be exchanged, can be the basis for an economy. I did my PhD in national income accounting, and I went to the OECD in 1982 to work on national income accounts. As you all know, this is a business audience. Accounting is a convention. It's something we decide. Accounting is not something given for all time. We change accounting, and accounting evolves. The accounting that we have today for national income accounting came out of the 19th century and was consolidated by Keynes in the beginning of the 20th century and was made into actual numbers in the 1960s at the OECD. These conventions change. One of the things that we're talking about here is knowledge, the knowledge society, the society where people think and share ideas. The question of content was already raised. Where does the content come from? But what do we mean by this? In Europe, the Lisbon Agenda was something that was said at the beginning of this century, in the year 2000, we're going to have the greatest knowledge economy and knowledge society in the world. But what did we mean by this knowledge society? Well, one way of defining it is to say know how, know who, know what, and know why. And to think about that every day, that you work on it, that you're engaged in it, that every day it's part of what you do. If we look at this kind of graph, which compares the agricultural society to the industrial society, to the learning-intensive society, you see that all of those knowledge activities increase. We do more know what, we do more why, we do more who. Those things increase. And that means the intensity of what you do every day is the knowledge intensity of society. But that's a learning challenge. If I have to meet somebody new, I have to learn about them. I have to be able to understand what they say. I have to be able to negotiate the meaning. If I have more access, because I have Google, and I can Google something immediately, I have access to all this know what. And if I have to say, who am I? What does it mean to be a father? What does it mean to be a person today? What is my career? I'm asking a question about why. Why am I doing what I'm doing? So I'm involved in knowledge intensity all my life. It's not just I will do what I'm told. It's not just I will do what my father did. It's not just I will do what the boss tells me or the teacher tells me. It's about being able to learn throughout life. And that's one way of defining content. So let me talk about systemic economic transformation to give you a bit more of a concrete idea of what this is about. So here I want to talk about something I call unique creation. What is value? How do we organize value and the predominant type of economic activity? You understand the economist in me is talking. Here I want to talk about unique creation in a very specific way, beyond mass production and mass consumption. We can imagine it in terms of how the value is organized, so that's in terms of unique creation or mass production, and we can think of it in terms of the relationship that you have to the object of value. What is your relationship to production? So it can be highly learning intensive or it can be low learning intensive. So here at the low mass end, we have mass production, industrial. In the middle, we have the empowered teamwork shopper who's empowered. And up at the top, we have the artist, the researcher, the learner. But I don't mean the genius artist. I don't mean Picasso and Steve Jobs, the person at the very top. I mean something that's related to banal creativity that everybody engages in. And you know this as a business audience, that we're talking about mass customization. We're talking about personalization. With the Minister of Education in England 5 years ago, I ran a conference on personalization of education. 3 weeks ago, I was in Alberta, in Canada, talking about personalization of healthcare. Personalization, what's the obstacle? In industry, we can create many, many catalogs. So let me ask you, if I have a pen here, and I wanted to create a pen for each person in this room, this is my pen, and I say, well, there should be a customized, personalized product. I'm going to engage in mass customization, and everybody in this room will have a pen that's just right for them. Well, I can engage many engineers and many artists and produce a big catalog and put it on Amazon or put it on the internet, and you can go and look at the catalog, and very quickly you'll get tired. Oh, I've been looking at this, I've been looking at that, and you won't use it very much. The way that we personalize is for the moment of value added, the moment of creativity, to move from the supply side to the demand side. The answer for content is not to have more publishers, to not have more movies, to not have more teachers putting out content. It's to transform the capacity of everybody to be on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter. It's to create content uniquely everywhere all the time. That's unique creation. But it challenges one of the fundamental concepts that we use for industrial society, which is the relationship between supply and demand. This is beyond the dualism of supply and demand. And what I want to try and really impress upon you is that this idea of supply and demand, it structures our thinking. It changes the way we look at the world. And if we only look for a demand-side solution or a supply-side solution, we've actually cut the world into two pieces that actually obscures the emergent, what is emerging and new and novel. It occults, it hides the emergence of the systems. So just to give you an idea, though, that this is something that's not completely far-fetched, to tease your imagination, how many of you have heard of prototype printers? Prototype printers were on the cover of The Economist about a month, 6 weeks ago. Prototype printers can build a pen. They build a pen by going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and building up layer by layer by layer a three-dimensional object, okay? And the reason that it was in on The Economist cover recently was because if you do a CAD-CAM design of a propeller, of an engine, and you print it out, you can then assemble it, which is what they did over there. They assembled an engine using a desktop printer. And the other reason that it was on The Economist cover was that in Las Vegas recently, in December of 2010, the first car was demonstrated that had been produced by a desktop factory. Just imagine for a moment, there are many things that are exported from many different parts of the world. I'll take the example of toys, one sector that's very heavily dominated by production from China. toys come from China, at least mostly in Europe and in North America. If you could produce your own toys with your own colors, with your own designs, mixing up. Oh, and you had a very nice design last year. I'll borrow from you, and I'll mix it with the design that you had, and I'll mash it up, and I'll create my own product, and I'll print it on my own desktop. What happens to the container ships? What happens to the factories in China producing toys? The industrial logic gets broken. The sequence and the segmentation, demand-supply reallocation, changes. And the relationship that's been so fundamental to the industrial society of conception, management, execution also changes. This is unique creation. It's about networked, just-in-time, do-it-yourself, DIY. It's about refinement of taste and choice. It's about experience and identity. It creates unique creation. It's clouds of value creation, and it transforms the organizational foundations. I want to offer you a little video that's a visual metaphor of the idea. In English, this activity, these birds flying together, is called a murmuration. That's the name of a flock of birds, starlings. Think of that as the economy, where the roles are changing. You don't have companies. There are no more firms. You connect. A bunch of us connect. We produce something. I'm the conceptor. You're the implementer. Then the next time, I'm the implementer. You're the conceptualizer. We move back and forth. This is a visual metaphor for the unique creation, learning-intensive economy. There's no up, there's no down, there's no center. Now, something quite important about this. The birds were not taught. There was no plan. Nobody said, aha, now we're going to learn to go up and down and back and forth. The actual algorithm of the birds is not complex. What is complex is the creation of the conditions for the murmuration. And the challenge we have from a policy point of view, from the perspective of saying, how can we improve the content, the effectiveness of learning in Brazil, is not so much the question of saying, can we create better birds? It's a question of, can we create conditions for the birds to act differently? That's an important and difficult question. It's a creative question. So the murmuration has a particular attribute to it. The murmuration is starlings flying in a flock, and clouds of unique creation, collaboration. It's very fluid, but it has something else. So this is my second word that I want to give you. Murmuration, the birds flying, fluidity, but also the word heterarchy. In most of the parts of the world that I go to, the word heterarchy is not very familiar. It's the opposite of hierarchy. What is heterarchy? Well, hierarchy we know. The rich are on the top and the poor are on the bottom. The best competitors on the top and the worst competitors on the bottom. But how about the happiness of the worst competitor and the happiness of the best? Or the happiness of the poor person and the happiness of the rich person? They're not comparable. We live in a world in which we understand how to manage and organize hierarchy, but we have only started to understand what it means to think about creating the conditions for heterarchy. And heterarchy is one of the great challenges of our time because it's precisely content. It's precisely local. It's precisely somebody in the Amazon and somebody in Rio who has their own specificity, the richness of their own information. And one is not better or worse than the other. But we don't have ways to think about that and to organize that because we have hierarchical methods. Who am I? The challenge of identity when we have the capacity to be free, beyond the passive, beyond the imposed. And here again, I want to offer you just a little chart that talks about the change. If we have heterogeneity, if we have a lot of different scales of social affiliation, I'm connected to many, many different groups. You're connected to many, many different groups. You enter new groups, you leave, the groups die, the groups are born. It's very fluid. There's birth, death, entry, and exit. There's fluidity of networks. And you have lots of decisions to make. All the time you're making decisions. What, when, how, who. And because you're doing that, you're practicing. And you have the capacity to be in a learning-intensive context. And you get to understand that we are no longer necessarily in the old dualism of the individual versus the state, or the collective as the state. The government, the state, is not the only aspect of the collective. Everybody here has a cell phone, I assume. Did anybody tell you to get the cell phone? Did a government say you should get the cell phone? Did the fact that everybody here has a cell phone change our collective condition? Yes. The collective conditions we live by are not just government, are not just the state. They emerge. They're part of a process. And so if we start to think about this decision-making capacity, our capacity to make decisions, if we have the transparency and access to information, if we have the chance to experiment and to learn from our mistakes, to learn by doing, we can, all things other being equal, improve our decision-making capacity. Now, you're all here in this room, so you made the choice to be here. But maybe if you'd gone someplace else and bought a lottery ticket, you would be very wealthy now. So maybe you made the wrong decision. There's no way to know. We can't go back in the past and play it over. But if we have more information, and if we have more experience, then in theory, we can be better at making decisions. And guess what? That is equal to wisdom. Do we talk about wisdom very much in industrial society? No, in industrial society, we talk about the strength of your back and your pension. It's very odd that this industrial world that we live in is the only civilization that doesn't talk about wisdom and value wisdom. So here, the capacity for reframing and sense-making, for spontaneity, is part of what wisdom is all about. The Industrial Revolution was an amazing thing. This is a quote from a historian. After 1780, the population of Britain nearly tripled. The average income of the population more than doubled. The share of farming fell from just under half to just under 1/5 of the nation's output, and the making of textiles and iron moved into the steam-driven factories. So strange were these events that before they happened, they were not anticipated, and while they were happening, they were not comprehended. Significant, major change, which alters the way we think and what we imagine, happens. So the question now for us is, can we think in this way? And I want to get back to this question of broadband, education, and social inclusion. And the way we think about broadband, bigger highways, faster pipes. We think about it in industrial terms. Education, the school is a factory for the factory society. And equity, the social inclusion that we think about, as important as income and conditions of life are, and that's absolutely crucial, and we know we have the capacity to give everybody basic subsistence. We have that ability. That doesn't mean we achieve it, but we know that we have that ability. The question then becomes, in our differences, can we understand our relationships and create equity which is related to difference as well as to equality? And so if we think of knowledge creation as living knowledge and the renewal of that knowledge. So here the illustration would be, if a language is dying, it's not being renewed. Somebody speaks it, the grandmother, but the children don't speak it anymore. So the space where the stock of knowledge is not being renewed is dying. So we have knowledge creation through the public sector, where some of it is preserving. And universities and schools play a huge part in deciding what knowledge is preserved. But they also play a role in creating new knowledge. So does the private sector. The private sector also preserves and creates new knowledge. Then there's all that knowledge that's created outside. So I'm thinking here of education, and thinking of how we can cover all of it. And thinking of learning as community, learning as belonging, to think of learning as something that's related to our identity and as becoming, and learning as meaning and experience, and learning as practice. If we can encompass all of this learning, think of what happens in schools. Think of what happens to broadband. Think of what happens to our relationships to each other. We move towards this practical and fluidity of the learning-intensive society. It alters the foundations for diversity and identity. The way we define diversity, the way we define identity, Brazil is a highly diverse society. The way we define that, though, changes over time. It doesn't remain the same. The flexibility of life. We live in ways which we could not live before because of mobile, because of broadband, that allows us a flexibility and an interdependency that changes the basis for transparency and trust. What we trust, how we have confidence, how we build up confidence. I did work for Cisco on telepresence and how telepresence can be used to create new relationships. But our norms, our habits for creating trust and transparency, they need to transform. So if we think of this as a framework, we have to think of network fluidity, complexity, spontaneity, creativity, and wisdom. This is a new framework for thinking about policy, for thinking about broadband, for thinking about telecommunications, because it changes some of the key issues we look at. To be very tangible and very quick, let me give you a few examples. Identity, citizenship, birth certificates, social security cards, and the panoply of rights that we take for granted now need to be extended into cyberspace. It is time to establish the infrastructure for cyber citizenship. Frankly, I've been working on this for 15 years, talking about cyber citizenship. Property rights. The new relationships between property rights and finance need to be based on accounting systems that rest on clear and operational systems that validate and valorize two key asset classes. Let me just point out, you know the mercantilist period, the period when Venice was the most important center for trade. Well, one of the key elements of Venice's success was double-entry bookkeeping, accounting. And one of the crucial innovations of that time was the bill of exchange, a financial instrument, an instrument that was used to make transactions. Our transaction systems and our way of accounting, in order for the business models of the rich content society to succeed, for you to have the content that you want to see created, you need to have these new institutions that validate the richness of people's property, copyleft, and human capital, what I call no banks. Transaction systems have to do with peer-to-peer, business models that require this peer-to-peer exchange. There's a whole story to be told about the difficulty of changing our payment systems. But if we can't change our payment systems, it's very difficult to change our business models. Shared meaning. The same thing goes for language. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard about the semantic web and the question of folksonomic definitions, negotiated meaning. If we don't have the capacity to develop those shared understandings, shared meanings, it's very difficult to use the richness of the web to create the fluidity of a learning-intensive society. Recently, I did some work with a company called Promethean that some of you may know. They do interactive whiteboards. And we're talking about a leap in learning productivity. If you look historically, these things happen throughout society. It's not just in a school, it's not just in a workplace, but it's a social phenomena. It happens in the economy, technology, and society as a whole. And here, we see changes in the way we use the future. We rediscover the motivation to learn. There's much to discuss around the question of the motivation to learn and how that impacts on the technologies we put in schools. We reduce the fear and the reaction to change. We make learning matter for value. And we can think about using the future to embrace complexity. This is an image of the Middle Ages. This is the 15th century. This is an image, a fanciful image of Shanghai in 2100. What image are we using of the future? I'll end with this quote. The human condition can almost be summed up in the observation that whereas all experiences are of the past, all decisions are about the future. The image of the future, therefore, is the key to all choice-oriented behavior. The character and quality of the images of the future which prevail in a society are therefore the most important clue to its overall dynamics. My question to you, what image of the future are you using? And how did you create that image? Where did it come from? What is your idea of the future? What are the tools you are using to think about the future? And have you thought about how the image of the future changes what you see in the present? For my 50th birthday, which is 4 years ago, I had this gift. It's a picture from Painel, an artist, a French artist. And it's about a person going across the precipice on a tightrope. And that way of thinking, let somebody take me from A to B. Find the hero, the great idea that will show me the way. That way of saving us, I don't think it works. The way we anticipate matters, it changes the present. Use the future to embrace complexity. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Mr. Riel Miller for this fantastic presentation that will contribute greatly to the success of this event.